right. So we're gonna just start off with who you are, your age. Just tell me your name.
Sure, I'm Paul Butler. I'm 53 years old, and I'm a law professor at Georgetown.
Okay. And where did you grow up?
I grew up in Chicago, Illinois, on the South Side.
And what is one of your earliest memories growing up in Southside Chicago?
Well, my whole family lived on the South Side. I have very fond memories of growing up there. It was an all African-American community. Martin Luther King described Chicago as one of the most segregated cities that he had ever seen. And so I didn't know any white people at all. I never would go for days without seeing them. I don't think I really had any white friends until I went to college.
And who were your parents?
My mother is retired now. She was a public school teacher in Chicago during the time that I was growing up. And my father was an actor. He lived in Chicago for prior to the time that I grew up. My parents were divorced or separated. He lived in Chicago for a while, and then he moved to New York.
And what were your parents like growing up with them, with your mom?
Oh, my mother was very hardworking. Her father was a Pullman porter, which was a great job for a black man to have during that time. My mom, I guess she grew up in the 50s, and so being a Pullman porter was like a prestigious job. So her father would take the railroad. He was what black people call a railroad man. So he would go to LA a lot from Chicago. So in that sense, my grandmother, my mom's mother was a full-time stay-at-home mother. So I think my mother had kind of a middle-class upbringing, even though neither of her parents had gone to college. That was what was black middle class then, especially, again, to have a great job like a Pullman porter. So my mother basically, I think, wanted, in terms of education, to go to the next level. So she had my sister and I when she was pretty young, before she finished college, but she still persevered, and she was actually studying to be an elementary school teacher at the same time that my sister and I were in the elementary school. She was studying to be a primary grade teacher when we were in the primary grade. So my sister and I always tease our mother that she uses us as kind of guinea pigs to see what would work on kids. But my sister and I both did very well academically when we were in elementary school and high school. So I guess it worked.
Yeah. How long did you live in Chicago?
I lived in Chicago my whole life until I went away to college when I was 17, and I've been back to Chicago a lot since then, but I haven't lived there.
Ever since. And
I should say, since we're talking about Chicago, my mother, and I know you're interested in people's experiences with the criminal justice system, Chicago famously had a police department that during the 60s and 70s was notorious, especially for how they treated young African Americans, really not just young, but any African American. And my mother was also kind of a black militant during the 60s, so I remember us going to hear Malcolm, not actually Malcolm X, but Martin Luther King. Actually, I would have been too young to remember hearing him, but I remember going to like civil rights demonstrations, and definitely absorbing a lot of those militant values or pro-African American values. But I remember once when I was riding my bike, and I loved to ride my bike when I was a kid. And again, you'd have to ride a long way to leave the African American neighborhood that I grew up in. But there was a white neighborhood that was maybe a half an hour bike ride from where I lived. And I would often ride there just because it was far, and I liked to ride my bike far. I remember I was riding my bike in that neighborhood once, and a police officer rolled up in a car. He rolled down his window, and he said, "Is that bike yours?" And I said, yes, is that car yours? Talking about his police car.
Yep.
And then I sped off on my bike. And then I got home and I told my mom what I said, and she spanked me. And she said, don't ever talk to a cop like that because you could end up dead. And so I do remember, receiving that as kind of a mixed message. On the one hand, my mother was very militant, but on the other hand, she had this like kind of very legitimate fear about what the police could do to me. And I think a lot of black parents, have a tough time talking to their children, especially their sons, about the criminal justice system. And, I guess you don't want to have make a kid scared of the police. But you almost have to do that when you're thinking about the tragic consequences of young black men not coming across properly to the police.
And how do you think Chicago, Southside, has changed from when you grew up to now? Or lack thereof?
Yeah, I don't think it's changed a lot, actually. The South Side, where I grew up, is still all black. Parts of it have become more Latino, but it's definitely majority people of color. And that part of Chicago, I think, is still fairly segregated. There are definitely other parts of Chicago that have become more gentrified. So the most famous example is what was once the notorious Cabrini Green housing project, which was one of the worst housing projects in the country, was just torn down. The way people in Chicago describe it is this overnight, like one day it was there and the next day it wasn't. I'm sure it wasn't actually overnight, but it was in a area that, like most urban areas in D.C., or most urban areas in the country, including Washington, D.C., has gone from predominantly minority to this predominantly white young professional class. So we've seen that in D.C., we've seen it in Harlem and Fort Greene. Although the transition isn't, in Harlem, it's not complete, but it definitely seems like an evolution. And so that's happened in parts of Chicago, but it hasn't happened in the area that I grew up.
And do you have any siblings?
Yeah, I have one sister who is a year younger than I am.
And what was it like growing up with her?
Oh, it was great. We were very close because, again, we were close in age. When it came time to go to high school, the public schools I'd gone to for elementary school were great schools, and I got a great education there. But my mom had some concerns about the public high schools. And so she ended up sending both my sister and I to Catholic schools. And in Chicago, at that time, Catholic schools were kind of like a midway point between public schools and fancy private schools. So there were a number of fancy private schools that were expensive, like way out of my mom's budget. There's schools like the Chicago Latin School and Francis Parker that are well-known schools, like schools where the one of those is a school where the Obamas sent Sasha Malia before the president was elected. But we couldn't afford those schools. At the same time, my mother didn't want me to go to a public school because she thought that I wouldn't get the best education. So Catholic schools were kind of an interim because they were still private, obviously, but they weren't nearly as expensive as the elite private schools. And so I went to a Jesuit school called St. Ignatius that was considered, I think, properly one of the best schools in Chicago. It still is considered that way. And I was reluctant to go because it was an all-boys school, and I didn't want to go to an all-boys school, but that time all of the Catholic schools were single-gender schools. And I got a great education there. I'm very happy that I went there. It was a Jesuit school, like Georgetown, where I now teach law, is a Jesuit school as well. So the Jesuits have a strong commitment to social justice. And even though I'm not Catholic, I think the social justice message is extremely important. So I like being part of an institution that have social justice as their core missions, as part of their core mission. So I appreciated that part about going to the school as well as the education that I got. And my sister, again, she went to a girls' school. Now St. Ignatius is thankfully co-ed. But at that time, none of the, I think it's fair to say that none of the girls' Catholic schools were as good as St. Ignatius. So she went to a school where she got a great education, but I don't think as good as what I got at St. Ignatius. And she, but again, we did well. My sister went to Harvard for college, and I went to Yale. So, I guess you can't argue with success.
Exactly. Yeah. That was actually going to be my next question. Were you able to further your education past high school? What was college like for you? Since we're talking?
College was great. I loved Yale. It was the first time in my life I was outside of the south side of Chicago, living outside there. My freshman year roommates were a rich white guy from Spokane, Washington, and this Jewish kid from Brooklyn, and an Asian American guy from Connecticut. So we were extremely diverse just in our little room. We got along very well. I'm not really in touch with any of my roommates from my freshman year, although one of them I ended up being roommates with, the Asian American guy. We ended up being roommates for all 4 years. Even when I moved off campus, we were still roommates. So we got along very well. There was when people talk about the presence of students of color in majority white institutions, they talk about the importance of having a critical mass of students of color. And at that time, there was a critical mass of black students at Yale. So I felt very comfortable, both in the African American community and in the larger community. So, it's a great school. I really appreciated the education and all of the opportunities I had outside of the classroom at Yale.
And how do you think you changed or grew during your college years at Yale?
Well, I definitely became a political activist. I was involved in a lot of projects to continue to make sure that the students and faculty at Yale were diverse, and that it was a climate where African American students felt welcome. I had a very diverse set of friends, not just African American friends. I had a lot of gay friends. I had a lot of friends who were feminists, a lot of women especially who were very into being feminists. So I think I definitely kind of shored up my progressive values while I was there.
And how would you describe yourself in one word during college, like Yale?
Happy. It was just a very happy time in my life.
And if you don't mind me asking, throughout your childhood or your young adult life, have you ever had trouble or had any encounters with the police? You did explain to me the one incident on the bike.
Yeah, I've had a number of encounters with the police, which I think is typical of African American men. So they've ranged from, minor irritations to, when police see me walking down the street, especially if I'm in a majority white neighborhood or campus like at Yale, kind of just slowing down to just take an extra look at me, to being stopped, especially when I've been in my car, ordered to get out of the car, frisked, to being arrested for a crime that I didn't commit. So I've had too many experiences with police officers.
And you did just say you were arrested one time. Can you explain what happened? What were your feelings during that time? Who did you call?
Yeah. So, it's a long story. This was actually after I graduated from law school, and I was working for the Department of Justice. So I was actually a prosecutor. And I was arrested for a crime that I didn't commit. And I tell the story about what happened in my book, Let's Get Free, A Hip-Hop Theory of Justice. So the kind of short version is I had rented my parking space in my apartment complex to a woman who had a car. I didn't actually have a car, so I didn't need it. So I thought it was a way I could bring in a little extra money. And there had been the parking space, or my apartment actually, had been vacant for a while. So no one who used the apartment had been parking there. And unbeknownst to me, one of my neighbors had been renting out the parking space on her own, even though it didn't belong to her. And she got mad when she saw that someone else was now using the space. And she started leaving threatening notes on my parking space tenant's car. And my tenant was afraid, but parking was at a premium, so she wasn't going to stop parking there based on these notes. But I thought that if I could catch her in the act of putting a note on the car, because they were threatening notes. And again, the woman who was doing it obviously didn't sign her name, but we both my tenant and I thought we knew who she was. So the woman who was leaving these notes, again, she was angry at me. So one morning I woke up and there was all this sawdust on the car that was parked in the space. And I saw this from my window, and when I went outside to see what was going on, the police came and arrested me. And it was surreal. I was like, okay, I'm here looking at this car that has sawdust on it, and I'm being arrested. And they literally just walked up to me and said, get something like, get the fuck away from the car. And so I said, well, what am I being arrested for? And they said, assault, simple assault, which is a misdemeanor. That's like what you get charged with if you get into a fight with someone or you push someone. And they said that this woman had said that I pushed her and made her fall. And it was just, again, the whole thing was surreal. It just made no sense. And so I said, but, call my tenant. She'll explain to you what's been going on, why this woman has a beef against me. But, it just, when did I do this? The whole thing just didn't make sense. And they said, well, we don't care. It turns out that this woman was a police informant or a snitch. So she had a history of working with these police officers. So I basically think that they were doing her a favor, maybe. And it was, it was an easy favor to do, because when they saw me as a young black man, I think that, sometimes they think, well, he's guilty of something, even if it's not this. He's guilty of something. And then maybe part of it was all they were doing was arresting me. So they probably didn't think that for a young black man, an arrest was a big deal. And it is a big deal for anybody. And it was a big deal for me, not just because I was a prosecutor with the Department of Justice, but because the experience of being arrested is humiliating. It's degrading. You're treated as someone who's less than human. So, I was fine because I had, I had any number of lawyers I could call. When I got my proverbial quarter to make the phone call, I actually had to stop and think. I knew so many lawyers, I had to think of, well, who do I want to call? So I was in a much better position than, 99% of young black men who get arrested. And I ended up going to trial, and I won, of course. It was I still hear that it's one of the shortest deliberations by a jury ever. The jury came back literally in less than 10 minutes with a not guilty verdict, in part because at the trial, the person who said that I assaulted her, it was clear to the jury that she wasn't telling the truth. And in fact, her neighbors said that she lied about everything. They told the jury that, and that when she told them this, that they didn't believe her because they know that she lies about everything. So I actually feel sorry for that woman because I think she's clearly, at least at that time, was clearly mentally ill. But I think it was so evident that she was mentally ill that, the police should have been more skeptical of her claims. And if the police weren't, then the prosecutors should have been. But it's almost like if you get arrested, you're put in this assembly line of justice. So the assumption is that you're guilty. So you're just supposed to kind of go along. And a lot of people don't really question the assumption that you're guilty. And, fortunately, I had the resources that I was able to prove that I wasn't guilty.
And what would you say to someone who feels that young black men are overthinking their double consciousness, or feeling like that the police are attacking them, or don't feel comfortable in their own skin, and that it's their fault, that they're overthinking that this is probably because I'm black? How do you address somebody like that says such a thing?
Well, I don't think it's wrong when black men get more attention from the police to think that that's happening because they're black. That is the reason why it's happening. We know that that's the reality, and we know it from, relatively, I won't say my experience was harmless because it had a big impact on my psyche, but obviously compared to what happened to Michael Brown and Eric Garner, my experience was relatively harmless. So I think when African American men understand that a lot of this doesn't have anything to do with us as people, it really is just stereotyping and prejudice and racism. I hope that helps some people process these issues, process this kind of microaggression from police. But at the end of the day, it really shouldn't be on African Americans to resolve. It should be in the police to resolve, because African American men are part of the people who they're supposed to serve and protect. And if you're scared of the people who are supposed to serve and protect you, or think that they're not doing that at all, they're really out to get you. If those people are the agents of the state, which police officers are, then it's not just a crisis in criminal justice, it's actually a crisis in democracy and the legitimacy of the government. So that's why I think it's so important to work these issues out.
What lessons did you learn from this time in your life? And as you was just stating, how do you feel about the justice system, and in light of the current events of Michael Brown and Eric Garner?
Well, I think the Justice Department or the justice system needs improvement. One concern is about over-enforcement of law. So African American young men are the most incarcerated group of people in the history of the world. There's never been a segment of the population that has experienced the kind of hyper-incarceration that young African American men experience today. And a lot of that has to do with the war on drugs, which is waged in a racially discriminatory way. So blacks don't use drugs more than any other group. but they're much more likely to be arrested for drug use. So I have concerns about that over-enforcement of law. At the same time, in cases like Michael Brown and Eric Gardner, we see under-enforcement of law too, when we have African-American victims and white assailants. So it's not just in those two cases, but it's been demonstrated over and over again that when white folks are violent against African Americans, they don't get the same punishment as African Americans get when they commit similar kinds of crimes. So that's under enforcement of law as well as over enforcement of law. So I think that both of those need to be corrected. The main thing, though, is that we rely too much on punishment. Overall, the United States locks up more people than any country in the history of the world. And, of course, African Americans are disproportionately the victims of that kind of punishment, that punishment regime. So I think that we need to think more creatively about ways to deal with antisocial conduct. When people rob or steal or hurt other people, that's a problem. And that is more of a problem in some communities than others. So I think that we shouldn't gloss over the fact that crime in low-income African-American neighborhoods is a big deal. I think we have to be more creative about the ways that we respond to that crime and think outside of just locking up people in cages. Maybe if that actually made neighborhoods safer, I would be more in favor of it. But we've seen that the criminal justice punishment regime has all of these unintended consequences, including breaking down the African American family in a way that's consistent with what slavery did and what Jim Crow segregation did, with all this economic deprivation that African Americans have experienced, the ways that it's devastated black families and communities. We now see criminal justice doing the same thing.
And how would you describe the relationship between cops and prosecutors? And if you were a New York prosecutor in Staten Island or in Ferguson, you're the prosecutor, what would you have done differently? What would you have done?
I think for prosecutors who are local DAs, when they work with the police every day, it's hard to investigate them impartially because, for one thing, you like them. It's generally the same small group of police officers who make the arrest over and over. Being a cop is it's like having most other kinds of jobs. There's a few people who do the vast majority of work. So there's just a few cops in most jurisdictions who make the most arrests or make most of the arrests. And you get to know those cops when you're a prosecutor. And in general, you get to like them. And you need them to make your cases. So it's hard to be objective when there's allegations about wrongdoing among those cops because you don't want them to get mad at you, number one. And number two, because you like them, you don't want to get them in trouble. So I think the best way to respond to that conflict of interest that local prosecutors have is when there are allegations of wrongdoing by police, for there to be an independent prosecutor to step in and take a look at the facts from a more objective perspective.
And how would you describe both of these cases to a child?
I would say that the United States is a great country that has, unfortunately, a history of race discrimination and of judging some people, especially black people, based on stereotypes. And it's an issue where we're trying to do better. And I do think it's an issue that President Obama is very concerned about. So it's something that we're trying to do better. But the fact is that some people are still treated unfairly on the basis of the color of their skin. And that's what happened to Eric Garner, and that's what happened to Michael Brown.
And what would you encourage young people to do?
I would encourage people to become activists. This is the new civil rights movement. And I think it's exciting. We're seeing for the first time young people step up. So it's actually great because they're working along with some of the traditional civil rights organizations and leaders, but young people are doing their own thing. So the Black Lives Matter campaign, I think, is historic. And I think the way that we look back at the freedom riders in the 1960s and the students who were in SNCC and CORE, we're going to look at the Black Lives Matter, the Black Lives Matter campaign that's going on now as part of that same activism that really improved our country.
On a different note, so to say, what is the happiest moment in your life, professionally or not professionally?
Well, professionally, I've had a number of happy moments. It's hard to describe the happiest. It was, it was great getting a job teaching law, both at George Washington, where I started out, and then at Georgetown, where I am now. One of the first articles I published was about jury nullification. That got a lot of attention, so I appreciated being able to make a difference even as a young law professor. My book was published. It took me a long time to write, and it was well received, so that was also a very happy moment. So I'm blessed. I love my job, and I've had a lot of happy experiences as a lawyer and as a law professor.
And who's the most important person in your life? Who's had an impact on you?
Well, in terms of having an impact on me, I would say my mother is the most important person because she's really the reason why I was able to become the person that I am now, both in terms of her equipping me with the skills, in terms of how to learn, and with the values, in terms of wanting to make the world a better place, and of pursuing all of that with integrity. So again, I think all of that comes from my mom.
And just to trying to wrap up, do you have? I know we spoke about happiest. What are you most proud of so far?
Well, I think that one of the goals of my scholarship is to get people to be more thoughtful about criminal justice, and especially about how many people are locked up in this country, and about how race matters to criminal justice. So I think that's a debate that we're having now. It's a conversation that we're having now. So I'm proud that I have been able to, and I'm continuing to be able to play a role in that conversation.
And is there anything that you would want to talk about that we didn't get to?
No, I think your questions have been very good, so I feel like we've covered a lot.
Great. Is there anything else you want to add?
No, I think we're good.
Okay, all right. Thank you again,
You
Professor
bet.
Paul Butler.
Yeah, thank you. Great
It was
questions.
great.